Happy May the 4th. Keep it here.
It's May the 4th, therefore it is Star Wars Day. Happy May the 4th, my fellow YouTubies, and welcome back to the channel of Mike the Great Studios. Today, I will be giving a ranking of all 11 movies in my favorite movie franchise of all time, Star Wars. Now, George Lucas's creativity with this entire franchise has been amazing. He took all of this world and this mythology from all of his inspirational science fiction stuff that he had seen from the 70s and 60s. So this entire franchise that he's put together has just had a special place in my heart throughout the last 10 years at least. Now, I am aware that this is Star Wars we're talking about, and the entire Star Wars timeline and all these movies I know can get pretty critical sometimes. Over the years, I've seen people who've said they've hated the prequels, people who've said they've loved the prequels, people who have hated the sequels and said that the payoff for the sequels at the end didn't really work. So in the last week or so, I posted a bunch of polls on my community tab on what were some of the best movies out of the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy and the sequel trilogy. The original trilogy was actually not as divisive as I had expected it to be. It was a pretty good even score. There wasn't as much of a good argument on the prequels. However, Revenge of the Sith easily came on top with an 84% of you voting. And then the sequels didn't have as much of an argument. A majority of you guys, 71% of you guys, went for The Force Awakens. And when it came to the two standalone Star Wars stories, a majority of you, pretty much almost all of you guys, voted on Rogue One. There was only at least 8% for Solo, and Rogue One easily came out on top. So, at least from that perspective, a little bit of the world of Star Wars, I guess what you guys can say about it, there isn't too much of an argument between some of these movies, but I have heard some controversial arguments from most people on like what the best and worst movies inside of this franchise are. So there are possibly going to be some disagreements on this list if you're that one person in the world who does not take into account all the other opinions in this world of Star Wars. Now, without all that said, with all that out of the way, let's get into the video. So coming in last place for me is Attack of the Clones, and I don't necessarily think I'm alone on putting this one in last place. In the last few years-ish or two, I have seen a lot of other dislikes for this movie and a lot of criticism around it saying that it's the weakest of the prequels. So, there are some people that actually agree with me on this aspect, and that's mostly because I find it to have most of the biggest weaknesses that the prequels had played throughout it. Mostly because I feel like throughout the prequels, the issues there are some of the lines of dialogue I don't think work together, and it has some weird usage of CGI and graphics throughout it, and all those problems I think are played out pretty well here in Attack of the Clones. And mostly the biggest example of that is that I feel like the chemistry between Anakin and Padme isn't as viable because their little lines of dialogue inside of it just seem a little bit cringe-inducing. Like, Hayden Christensen is making some lines about sand, which comes off a little strange. Just the way that the kind of example, like the way to show their entire love story, and some ideas throughout it just don't exactly make any sense. Like, C-3PO was working at the Lars family farm, which, taking into account what happens in A New Hope, that seems a little strange that he would actually be in that setting in that all that time ago. And there's the whole thing with Count Dooku not really showing up until an hour into the movie. So during the mid half of the movie, there's not really a sense of like urgency to actually get us like motivated inside of the story. While Anakin and Padme are out on their little love adventure with the little lines of dialogue, Gobi is out just planet hopping from Kamino to Geonosis on this little investigation. But the mystery of who assassinated Padme doesn't really have as much of a sense of intrigue because we kind of already suspect who this killer really is. So there's a lot of issues that I can come across with this movie, and it has most of the stuff that I hate about the prequels, which was that some of the way that they had showed us this world inside of before time of the original trilogy. Some of the ideas that they had in there seemed a little strange. Boba Fett now has ties to the clone troopers, which is it seems interesting how that whole thing works, but I mean, it just like doesn't get me invested in, doesn't do anything much for the Boba Fett character in my opinion. So this movie still is enjoyable enough for being a Star Wars movie, but for me, it's easily been the weakest of the bunch. Making it into the top 10 is The Last Jedi. Now, I am aware that this has been the most divisive film in this entire franchise. It's a movie that the critics surprisingly loved. They gave it a 91, and then I believe the audience gave it around a 46. So out of all the movies inside of this franchise, this is obviously the most divisive. And I've heard over the years people saying that it ruined their childhood, or that it saved Star Wars, it killed Star Wars. I'm somebody who actually really loved this movie when it first came out. I loved the special effects when I saw it. It has some of the most good-looking Star Wars visuals out of all these movies. I really love the crate fight sequence, the way that it's visualized, or even the throne room sequence, the fight with Rey and Kylo Ren. So this movie had a few things going on for it on at least a technical visualization level, and made for a great movie experience like that you could see. However, this movie clearly has some horrible ideas with heroism and all that, and Rian Johnson clearly did not want to make this a heroic Star Wars movie. And it's a movie that kind of disregards some of the stuff that was set up in The Force Awakens, because Snoke is easily killed off right out of the gate once we're introduced, and doesn't really get to play out. That plot doesn't really go anywhere, and it just disregards the ending of The Force Awakens. Now Luke is introduced as this stubborn old man who's not really looking to save the galaxy, which doesn't really fit into Luke's character. I just couldn't buy that this is what Luke would turn into many years later, coming off of where we saw him in Return of the Jedi, and it just kind of hurts Luke's character because he's not really heroic inside of this movie. And now add to that, it doesn't really do great heroics for the rest of our characters. Now Finn has this sort of love story with Rose Tico, and Poe is being antagonized by Vice Admiral Holdo. And even though we're kind of rooting for Poe on this little journey that he's got going on, so our characters didn't really have those moments to kind of be heroic inside of this movie. And it's a movie that disregards everything that the first film set up, which does not really make it enjoyable. Now looking back at this time, it was a lot of fun when I first saw it in the theater, but now every time I rewatch it through the prequels, it just really frustrates me. The direction that Rian Johnson decided to take with Luke, decided to take with the rest of the characters. So this movie is kind of a disappointment. At number 9 is Solo: A Star Wars Story, and this was an okay time when I saw it in the theater. It took one of my favorite characters in the Star Wars canon and brought him on his own little adventure. And what's so great about this movie is that it gave us a taste out of the criminal underworld of Star Wars. It's not about the Jedi or Sith. It's not about the political ideals between the Rebellion and the Empire or the Republic. It's just about Han Solo doing his thing, going on his little adventure. And I loved some of the casting decisions that they had inside of this movie. It was nice seeing Paul Bettany in a Star Wars project. Who knew that he can be a pretty conniving villain? And Alden Ehrenreich and Donald Glover were okay versions of younger Lando Calrissian and younger Han Solo. But they just didn't seem like as compelling as Harrison Ford or Billy Dee Williams. They didn't catch me as younger versions of these characters. And I also feel like this movie is pretty predictable because we already know that some of these characters aren't in Han's life later on. We know that Han doesn't end up with Kira later on, because then he wouldn't really end up with Leia. And so it makes this movie pretty predictable because we already know how the rest of the story for Han and Chewie goes on. And basically, it also doesn't stick out as very memorable inside of the Star Wars universe, because obviously it doesn't have high expectations for the audience or high stakes. So there's just not much going for it with this movie that I can really say about it to help it out. However, the big highlight was that Darth Maul scene. At number 8 is Rise of Skywalker, and I feel like this is the most creative out of the 3 Star Wars sequels, while still trying to have some heroic elements inside of it. Whereas with Last Jedi, I felt like it really dumbed down the heroics with most of these characters. This movie actually did somewhat of a hero's journey with some of these characters inside of the Star Wars universe. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it does that whole thing pretty well. Now, there are still some things that I really liked about this movie. It was my most anticipated movie of 2019. One of my most anticipated movies of 2019. I really loved the humor that it had inside of it. I love the friendship dynamics between Rey and Poe. We finally get to see some of that friendship between them. But that's not to say that this movie does have a lot of pretty big problems. And it feels like they went lazy with the conclusion to this entire Star Wars saga. Mostly because they decided to bring Palpatine back and do it in kind of like the weirdest sort of way, where it's like black dark force magic or something like that, and he starts to bring his whole empire back through a podcast or something like that. And then it's just the way that they put that whole thing together. It just felt like too last minute, and it wasn't really set up anywhere else inside of the last 3 couple of movies. And it also introduces some new force powers like pretty late inside of the franchise, where now it's revealed that force ghosts are actually able to hold lightsabers and use the force to lift things even after they're dead. What we see Luke do inside of this movie, which could have been pretty useful in any of the other movies inside of this franchise, especially the ability to bring people back from the dead. And I felt like Ben Solo's redemptive arc seemed a little too rushed, and there was a little bit more that they can do with that. And when you put all that together, this finale to the entire Star Wars saga feels pretty disappointing. So, whereas I really wanted this movie to be so much better, it just can't be. At number 7 is The Phantom Menace, and this was an interesting way to expand the Star Wars canon. It brings in some new ideals like the Trade Federation and the Galactic Republic and the battle droids. It expands the Star Wars lore in ways that the original trilogy didn't explore very well. So I like how this movie explores more of the world of Star Wars and expands it on a bunch of other levels. And we also get to see these characters in the before time. We see Obi-Wan as kind of this Padawan who isn't as wise as he is in the original trilogy. We see Yoda as this leader of the Jedi Council. So it shows us these characters in another time period, and it also introduces us to Luke and Leia's mother, Padme, showing her as this queen of a planet. So it shows the world of Star Wars in a nice new setting. And all this stuff is like put together pretty well, but I feel like, and sorry, I want to say that the best part about this movie obviously is the Darth Maul fight scene. That's the one that everybody talks about the most. So this movie has quite a few things going for it, but I feel like when it comes to the execution, it kind of falls apart with Jar Jar Binks and all the fart jokes, as well as some of the ideas of where you have to make Anakin a child, whereas meaning that like you can't really explore the romance dynamic between him and Padme because that's him dating a child dating a 15-year-old girl. Seems a little bit inappropriate. And so it also has that whole sequencing, like some of the story fill out where there's these long stretches with no action, especially because I feel like the movie slows down pretty well with the Senate hearings all on Coruscant. So I feel like this movie had a pretty good story going for it, but lost it a little bit with the execution. Still, It had a great Darth Maul fight scene, great lightsaber duels, and a great pod race also. At number 6 is Rogue One, and this functions both as a prequel to A New Hope as well as a tragedy in the Star Wars universe. And it answers some questions that people have been asking online on, like, oh, why is the Empire so stupid to put a weak spot inside of the Death Star's main reactor, allowing the rebels to blow it up? That's because Galen Erso had this revenge plan to put a fuse inside of the Death Star to blow it up. It's nice that it actually shows us some of those questions inside of this franchise, and some of the action I think worked pretty well throughout the final battle. This movie has such an emotional level in the final battle, whether it's in the space battle, but also because you know that some of these characters are not safe, that this is going to be a tragedy in the world of Star Wars. Add to that, it also had that amazing Vader fight sequence in the end of it, where with the choreography as well as the music, the Vader fight was obviously the standout. But this movie is also infamous for not having some very memorable characters. And that kind of makes it hard for you to have an emotional hit on their deaths in the third act, because they chose to kill off the entire cast of this movie. And the cast isn't entirely memorable. I feel like there was a little bit more done that they could have done to expand on these characters' stories and all that. But it didn't cause me to have too much of an emotional hit on the end of the movie. And that could make this movie a little boring to sit through at times. But still, it functions pretty well as a tragedy in the world of Star Wars. And it's fun to watch as a prequel to A New Hope. So I gotta give this movie a little bit more respect. This is actually an enjoyable enough movie in the Star Wars world. Making it into the top 5 is Return of the Jedi. Fun fact about this movie, this year is its 40th anniversary. It actually turns 40, I believe, on the 25th of this month. And in this past week, Lucasfilm actually decided to release it in theaters, if you're unaware. The timeline to see it actually expires today on May 4th. And 2 days ago, I actually saw it in the theater. So if you're interested in seeing it today, you might want to check it out. But when I actually saw it in the theater, I expected it to have them to release the original cut, but they decided to just use the special edition, which you can pretty much just watch on Disney Plus. But it would have been nice if they had the original cut, because it's the magic of seeing a movie with 1983 graphics. But it still had the ideal of seeing a 40-year-old movie in the theaters is actually still a pretty crazy experience. Anyway, this movie was an amazing conclusion to the original trilogy. It has some great action sequences, whether it's the skiff at Jabba's palace in the opening of the movie, or even the speeder bike chase with Luke and Leia, or the space battle at the end, the battle on Endor with all the Ewoks. This movie is just a fun ride inside of the original trilogy. But it also does some pretty great stuff on the character and story level, with Luke redeeming his father and going on this heroic journey as this savior of the galaxy and defeating the Emperor. And that throne room scene between Luke, Vader, and the Emperor is one of the greatest scenes in this entire franchise. It has one of the best lightsaber duels in this entire franchise, at least on a character and story level. Now, I will say that there are a couple of story issues and story choices that I don't think worked really well inside of this movie. I think that George Lucas's decision, the plot twist with Leia being Luke's sister, really makes that kiss from the Empire pretty gross and a little uncomfortable. And this movie also has the Ewoks, which are kind of stupid and function as just like these little puppet teddy bears, which make the original trilogy a little too kiddie for the most part. But still, this was a fun ride inside of the original trilogy and made for a great conclusion to this portion of the saga. So I still find this movie pretty enjoyable. At number 4 is The Force Awakens. Now, a lot of you guys are going to bash me for putting this movie so high on the list. I know that there are a lot of people out there who hate the Star Wars sequels right now, but that doesn't really hurt my case in saying that this movie was still a pretty fun time when I saw it in the theater. And mostly because I saw it on Christmas Eve of 2015. I was at least around like 11-ish years old, and I remember walking in there and seeing some of the audience's reactions to just the being brought back into this world explored from the after time of the original trilogy. I remember the theater was clapping when Han and Chewie first arrived on the Millennium Falcon, and they were clapping even at the end when Luke Skywalker had finally showed up, or even when R2-D2's the tarp is removed and they see R2-D2. The theater had just had some pretty big reactions with seeing these characters again. It was just such a great experience seeing this in the theater on Christmas Eve, and this movie came out when I was becoming a Star Wars fan. That's just a pretty enjoyable experience. But at the same time, it just has some great new characters with some great chemistry between the two of them. Rey and Finn, of course, the standouts between their relationship, and they even have like some great chemistry and great dialogue between Han and Chewie and Princess Leia. So the character dynamics in this movie, I think, worked pretty well, and it just made for a pretty fun ride. I really loved the journey that J.J. Abrams had took me on throughout this movie, and this movie obviously has the big problem for being too similar to A New Hope with the way that the story functions, especially when you have things like Starkiller Base blows up the Hosnian Prime that's taken out right out of in A New Hope, where Alderaan is blown up by the Death Star. There was just too many similarities that they probably had inside of this movie, and even with where Kylo Ren is pretty much Darth Vader, Rey is kind of Luke Skywalker. You can see some of those similarities inside of this movie. I also don't like the biggest problem with this movie is what still traumatizes me is the way that they decided to kill off Han Solo inside of this movie. Just one of our most beloved characters in Star Wars. I didn't mind if he died unless it was from a heroic sacrifice, but it was just the way that he died. Like the fact that he's killed by his own son. Like, I just hate the way that Han dies inside of this movie. I just don't know what they were thinking when they decided to go for that. When they decided to go in that direction. But every time I rewatch this movie, it just reminds me so much of the good times and what I loved about Star Wars back then. So for me, this is still one of my favorite movies inside of this franchise. Now, my top 3 were like the hardest choices on this entire list because all 3 of them are movies that everybody loves and just like all put at number 1, and they are all almost equally great. But I had decided there was like an easy choice for me on which part went where. So your favorite movie in Star Wars is probably going to be at number 3 or number 2. It's probably not going to be at my number 1 spot. But just remember that all 3 of these movies are equally great. So just because I don't have it at number 1, that doesn't change how I feel about this one. So just keep that in mind. Making it into the top 3 is Revenge of the Sith. And this is without a doubt the most gut-wrenching and emotional film in this entire franchise. It shows us the fall of the Jedi Order as well as the rise of the Empire, and gives us the origin stories of one of the greatest cinematic villains of all time, Darth Vader. It shows us the rise of Darth Vader. That's what this entire story was built upon. And I think that it just, even at the same time, it still functions as a pretty fun adventure. It gives us more of a taste out of the Clone Wars throughout the first hour of the film, and it kind of shows, but it also shows Palpatine a lot more as this front and center villain. Like, gives us a little bit more taste out of how powerful Palpatine is and how antagonistic he can be as a villain. And Ian McDiarmid's performance in this movie is pretty good. And it also functions even as a tragedy inside of the Star Wars world, inside of the prequels, and just showing Yoda going into exile, Obi-Wan Kenobi's loss for his apprentice, and just the rise of the Empire as we know it. And it still manages to have some great lightsaber battles. Obviously, the big standout being the one between Obi-Wan and Anakin, which just brings in a huge emotional hit seeing these two brothers fall out. And this movie has, I actually think this movie has the most lightsaber battles out of all the movies on this list. It has the most great lightsaber battles with all the great choreography inside of it. And it's obviously my favorite of all three of the prequels. So every time I rewatch this movie, every time I'm watching through the prequels, when I start off with Phantom Menace, I'm like, oh, I can't wait until I get up to Revenge of the Sith. Because this movie just functions as just a great movie inside of the Star Wars world and a great setup heading towards the original trilogy. So even though this movie didn't have a happy ending, it is still pretty enjoyable and obviously one of my absolute favorite Star Wars movies. The runner-up here is Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, which I usually actually just like calling this movie Star Wars because that was kind of what it was labeled as when it was first released in theaters. Anyway, the original Star Wars movie for me is still one of the absolute best, mostly because this movie was responsible for inventing blockbusters as we know it. If you look at some of the track record of movies from before 1977, there weren't really a lot of like movies that went for high spectacle as big as this movie. I mean, we had Jaws and the first Rocky film, but there weren't blockbusters as big as this one when it first came out. That is just pretty huge, how much this movie functions in cinematic history, like the big role that this movie plays out. But even without like all the history added into it inside of it, it's just a great adventure. Just this simple adventure of a farm boy going on an adventure to rescue a princess from a space station and going on it with this wise wizard as well as this pirate and a couple of droids. There's just a compelling story inside of that, and it just makes for a simple adventure just to sit through. And it even within that, it's able to bring us some of the most iconic characters in movie history with Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, Princess Leia, Darth Vader, Obi-Wan Kenobi, R2-D2, C-3PO, and yet even 46 years later, we're still watching and making movies about these characters right here. We just got a TV show, the last season of The Mandalorian that just came out, and Star Wars is still going just because this story right here was just so enjoyable, and it's like lived up to the test of time for the past 46 years. So this movie just plays a huge role in cinematic history, but it's also just an amazing, compelling adventure. This movie was actually, over the years, this movie has actually been pretty close to coming in at number one, but I just decided to move it back one because I feel like the movie slows down a little bit at the beginning where with C-3PO and R2-D2 on Tatooine, and I'll admit, the fight scene between Obi-Wan and Vader doesn't really live up when it comes to the choreography, and I don't hold that too much against the movie too much because I know it was the first lightsaber battle that they ever filmed, but when you compare it to everything that they've done from the after fact, the choreography in there doesn't exactly live up. So this movie was still just a pretty big part in cinematic history and just one of the greatest blockbusters of all time. So it is definitely number 2 on this list. But coming in at number 1 for me, I just gotta go with The Empire Strikes Back. This movie takes everything that was great about the first movie and just does it a whole lot better with the action, with the character development, with the music. It just brings everything up to the next level and expands this franchise in ways that make the first film a whole lot better. And it's just one of the greatest movie sequels of all time, where it created that scenario where our lead characters split into 2 different adventures and rejoin in the next few hours. It just has that kind of element inside of it that allows for a new creativity in what you can do with these kind of movie franchises. And add to that, it does what most great sequels do, which introduces some great, fantastic new characters. It introduced us to Yoda, to Lando Calrissian. It has Billy D. Williams inside of a Star Wars movie, which is pretty cool. And it even expands the stories for these characters that we really love, where Luke is actually on this journey becoming a Jedi, and we're seeing him training with a lightsaber, and we actually see him in a lightsaber battle. We see Han establish this relationship, this romance between Leia, while even trying to run away from these mistakes that he's made in his past, where his past is kind of coming to haunt him. There's just like some compelling ways that they can continue the stories with these characters. And add to that, I love how Darth Vader was a whole lot more front and center as the villain. In A New Hope, we got to see a little bit more of him and that same villain dynamic with Grand Moff Tarkin. But here, I feel like he is more prominent in this movie as the main villain. And it fleshes him out, his character, pretty well. And it also gives us one of the greatest movie plot twists of all time, where Luke finds out that Darth Vader is his father. So this movie has laid the foundation as one of the great sequels of all time. And it's also the movie that introduced us to the Imperial March and Yoda and the Force. It introduced us to the Force power, to what you can do with the Force for the first time. It just has some great settings, whether it's on the planet of Hoth, the planet of Dagobah, even in the city in the clouds. This movie just has like so much creativity inside of the Star Wars world. So this is not just my favorite Star Wars movie, this is my favorite movie of all time. This is the movie that I always get excited to play whenever I sit down to watch through the movies. This is my favorite movie of all time. So for me, without question, Empire Strikes Back comes in at number 1. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe if you like this video, and be sure to check out on my community tab. I did like dozens of other Star Wars polls. I did what's the best movie in the prequels, what's the best in the original, what's the best in the sequels, who's the best villain in Star Wars, who's the best hero in Star Wars. I did a bunch of polls on my community tab. You can check those out over on my channel if you just click the link to my channel. And just remember, I also got a couple of other videos dedicated to Star Wars. I got my collection of Lego sets and even a ranking of the TV shows. You can check those out. And be sure to like and subscribe. And remember, happy May the 4th. I will see you all next time. Goodbye.